Welcome back. And we're going to start on biology of consciousness. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. Real consciousness will address that subject, that very subject. Brain and function. First, this is kind of a generic brain scan, a picture of what is done in what parts of the brain. And the frontal lobes play a big role in the brain. They're the youngest. A lot of moral decisions are made there, etc. Temporal lobes, speech, behavior. Parietal lobes, a lot of sensations take place there. Right from left, language, reading, etc. And then the stem, which isn't shown here, is actually the oldest part of the brain. And so the brain is not mapped like a map of the earth. The countries have borders. The brain doesn't have strict borders. Some things are taking place in a lot of different places, but in general, this is the layout of what's there. But the real action is in the brain cells themselves. Now, my wife suffered from depression and bipolar condition for 40 years. And she took a lot of antidepressant medication, which helps with the synapses, which is at the heart of this whole thing. There is at the very bottom left, not the total bottom, it's on the left side about 2/3 of the way down, and it says microtubules. Remember that, because we're going to get into that a little bit later. If I don't, ask me about it, we'll talk about it. So basically, the brain is a complex area, and it was only recently, in about 20, 30 years, that brain scan equipment was able to start looking at it in more detail. But as one neuroscientist told me, he said it's like, right now our brain scan ability is looking at 35,000 feet down in a city and being able to tell there was a bank robbed on one corner. Impossible. We don't get a very good measure by brain scans, but we do our best. But the brain is made up of waves, electromagnetic energy, the same as what was in the universe and in Einstein's universe, Einstein's equations. And there are known different wavelengths that are related to various functions. So delta is in a coma, theta, sleep, alpha in mystical, which is related to mystical experiences, and quite often at the early morning hours in sleep, it'll be that way. And beta is when you're hard at work. So we know that much about it. But here's the interesting thing that's happening in science, is the role that the universe plays in consciousness. And it started to recognize that the brain's structure, network connections among the nerves of each cells of the brain's hippocampus, structural critical to memory and cognition, is similar to the universe's web-like network of aggregated matter and known universe, in the known universe, formed over billions of years since the Big Bang. So, other than the patterns being very similar, scientists were starting to notice these. And the brain magnitude is another issue. I always like to say, how big is the universe? So I ask the same thing about the brain. And I compared the brain and the universe. The brain has 100 billion cells. The universe, 100 plus billion galaxies. Brain, 1 billion neurons, nerves. Universe, 200 plus billion stars per galaxy. 100,000 dendrites, neurons. 20 plus billion trillion stars. 100 trillion dendrites, 13.8 billion light years. But it starts to get interesting here. 5% of the brain is conscious. 4% of the universe is visible. 95% of the brain is unconscious. 96% of the universe is invisible. Rather interesting. We're going to start focusing on the conscious and the unconscious as we go through. You'll start seeing that pattern. And so that's rather fascinating. Consciousness and universe. Consciousness seems to me to be such an important phenomenon that I simply cannot believe that it is something just accidentally conjured up by a complicated computation. It is the phenomenon. Sorry. It is the phenomenon whereby the universe's very existence is made known. One can argue that a universe governed by laws that do not allow consciousness is no universe at all. Is this guy a flake or what? This kind of flaky talk. I mean, just because we think we have consciousness, what's that got to do with that? I mean, how do they? Makes no sense. Sir Roger Penrose, Oxford physicist, he's the one that taught Stephen Hawking his math. Stephen Hawking didn't have the math. And I was blessed to meet this guy in Switzerland one time, recently, and this is a very young picture. But his book, The Phenomenon of Man the Emperor's No Mind, and Emperor's has no clothes, or whatever. It was fascinating. And so he's the one that was talking about the subject of AI and showing that. And he is working with Hammerhoff, who's going to be at a conference in Rome. We're working on, I'll talk to you about that. And they're working on quantum consciousness. Consciousness to matter. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. What is this guy, a nut job? I mean, really. I've read this, I thought, this guy's a loon. Max Planck, physicist, Nobel Prize winner for quantum theory. These physicists they're all talking about this. What's going on? What is going on? Universe and consciousness. Universe, as we know it, is a joint product of the consciousness observer and the observed. Teilhard de Chardin, priest, paleontologist. So it turns out that Einstein thought the universe was static and he had to change his approach. About that time, after that actually, neuroscientists started to realize that the brain is neuroplastic. It can change. And scientists thought it was static too. Well, it's not. And it's dynamic. Well, that opened the door on, well, how do we change the dynamics? Computers and consciousness. Here's the answer to your question. I show the untenability of the viewpoint that our thinking is basically the same as the action of some very complicated computer. It is not obviously that more computation cannot evoke pleasure or pain, that it cannot perceive poetry or the beauty of an evening sky or the magic of sounds, that it cannot hope or love or despair, that it cannot have a genuine autonomous purpose. It's not obvious. Roger Penrose again. Now, when I serendipitously met this guy, because you don't meet this guy too often, at a conference, I have round tables and for cocktails, and we go up to that, and there were only room for 4 people. And there was one empty space. He was occupying one of the 3. Well, I jumped on the opportunity. So he's talking about quantum mechanics. Well, I took quantum mechanics in graduate school. I only understood about 3% of what he was talking about. The terminology has just gone way off the radar screen. Biological redundancy. We are blessed that we only have one mouth, particularly me. Isn't it wonderful the way God designed us? Only one mouth. Everything else is 2. Eyes, ears, arms, legs, lungs, kidneys, brains. 2 brains. What is this all about? Brain dualities. What are the 2? Separate hemispheres, present and future, multi-stable perception, and the conscious and the unconscious. Now, these are not obvious from the titles, but I'll give an example of each one of these. We'll talk about them. The separate hemispheres. The right is visual, spatial perception, fact-checking, scientific observation. The left is language, organization, problem-solving, storytelling, theological constructs. Epilepsy was a terrible illness, and they determined that they could help people by severing the corpus callosum that connects the 2. And the corpus callosum is in the middle, and it's very small, and it connects the 2. And when you have epilepsy, they couldn't resolve it. They went to that, and they severed it, and it did help. Now, that's not practiced anymore, but it was rather interesting what happened. Since the 2 sides weren't talking to each other, they would hand a pencil to a person, and their right brain would realize that it's a pencil, but it couldn't tell the left brain what to say about it, so the left brain said it was an eraser. So they were having problems, but the epileptic seizures ended. Fascinating. Now, you'll find in consciousness and all this stuff, a lot of times you'll learn from the illnesses and the problems, not just studying the right thing, okay? So present and future. This is often referred to as the mythological Ulysses contract. Now, Ulysses, if you recall that mythology, was navigating waters, and there were sirens that would entice people to come in. And Ulysses wanted to experience this, but he was the captain, and that wasn't going to be too good because he gets carried away and he drags all his crew in. So he gave the crew instructions that they were supposed to wear earmuffs so they couldn't hear it, and then he would hear it and enjoy it, and then if he got carried away and tried to get them to move in, they wouldn't hear him. Well, that's the brain's ability. We plan for the future. So adjustable rate mortgages, we're taking a chance. Pay now or pay later. Civil contract. You're signing a contract. If something happens, what do we do? Who pays who? Sugar versus diet. I'm dealing with that right now. Do I eat the chocolate now, or put it off so I can lose weight? Lyndon, what decision did I make? I ate the chocolate. Sorry. Alcohol-free house. Fascinating. I wanted to give out alcohol, so I removed all the alcohol from the house because the problem was every time I had a craving, it was there. What I was saying is I don't have control over it if it's there, so I'm gonna bargain for the future and get rid of it. And we have that ability as humans. Advanced directives in medical care. Multi-stable perception. And you've all seen this. Is it faces or a vase? I contend that you can't see both at the same time. Now, other people will say, yes, we do. But I think that there's an instantaneous switch that you can't even recognize where you're flipping back and forth. Conscious and unconscious. This is the one that I think we want to focus on big time. Conscious, quality or state of being aware of external object or something within oneself. Unconscious, mind operating well outside the attention of the conscious mind, altered state of consciousness with limited conscious awareness. Now here's a word that I had to expunge from my vocabulary. Subconscious, layperson's replacement for unconscious. And it's avoided in academic and scientific settings. So we're going to focus just on conscious and unconscious. Conscious and unconscious. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. I had to throw somebody that's not a scientist and a theologian in. Consciousness will never fully understand itself, the unconscious, no matter how much we peek inside the brain. Kevin Nelson, MD. Conscious and unconscious. If the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but you know where I got that? Off of a fortune cookie at a Chinese restaurant. Then I had to go back and look at who said that. I cannot grasp all that I am. Emerson Pugh, I didn't know that until I looked up the quote on the fortune cookie. St. Augustine of Hippo. Interesting. If we can't grasp all that we are, then what do? We get in trouble. Relative characteristics. This is powerful in giving us a sense of the differences. Conscious and unconscious. So let's go through some examples of descriptive examples. Conscious is slow. The unconscious is fast. Conscious is very systematic. Unconscious, automatic. Unconscious is explicit. The unconscious is implicit. And I'm using words that I'm trying to help us to understand it because none of them by themselves really explain it. Conscious is analytic. Unconscious is heuristic. It's a way of saying it kind of takes unconsciously everything involved and throws it together. Rule-based, intuitive, proactive, reactive, reflective, impulsive, reason, emotion, neurocortex, limbic system of the brain. In other words, it's the youngest and the oldest. Remember, conscious is 5%, unconscious 95%. We got a problem. What are we going to do? So, consciousness test. Here's the answer to your question. The mouse and the electrified cheese. It goes catatonic. It just freezes. Now, at our level of consciousness, we would have pulled the plug, or we would have walked and found some other cheese. We would have done something. But the rat can't get past that point of, I have to eat to survive, but I might have to not eat to survive. Which is it? And it can't get past that. So animals have a certain level of consciousness, but this was an interesting test of how to determine it. And various species have different levels, certainly. I mean, parrots, they've taught multiple words to in language, etc. But I personally was not that interested in that. I was focusing on the human. Conscience and free will. Now, the Greek word synodesis means consciousness, external self-awareness, ideally true, not erroneous, etc. Example, there's a tree out there, I see it, and that thing exists. Conscience is the internal moral guide. Ideally sincere, not insincere. Murder is wrong. Unlike English, the word synodesis, unlike English, Greek and the Romance languages only have one word for both of these two. Very strange. I didn't know this. I was given a talk in Rome at Pontifical University, and I had simultaneous translation. And the lady, brilliant, comes up to me. I could never do this. She was left-brained. She said, how do I translate these? The difference. They only have one word in Italian. I said, well, here are the definitions. Finesse it. I don't know what you're going to do. And she was able to do that. Now, this concept of conscience was demonstrated in my own family. My grandson was about 6, 7, and we went fishing. And I took the worm and I showed him how to put the worm on the hook. And he said, "Grandpa, doesn't that hurt the worm?" It was then that I was glad I only had one mouth. I used to big philosophical questions from 6-year-olds. And I gave him some half-baked answer about what we have to eat and, But what was interesting is that he was displaying that internal conscience guide. And he was doing it in such a way that he was prepared to do something about it if he thought about it. Powerful moment of inspiration to me and learning. In spite of the fact I gave him a half-baked answer, I mean, it was, frontal lobes, how important they are. And this is how things work in the scientific world. Quite often, we learn from illnesses and mistakes to know what is really correct as opposed to what's the normal way. Frontal lobes. Well, there is a man by the name of Phineas Gage. Now, if you look at this picture carefully, his left eye is closed. Phineas Gage worked on the railroad in New Hampshire. And if you've ever driven in that part of the country, when they had to cut a path for the railroad, they would break rock off. And they do it with explosives. And they would drill vertical holes about this big and about 10 foot or so every 10 or 15 feet. And they would put dynamite in each one, wire them together, and all at one time they would explode it, and that wall of granite would just fall off. And what remains is the semicircles of those vertical cylindrical holes. And you can see it along the highway. You can see the highways, you can see that he was doing the railroad. And so he's holding the crowbar that he used. Now in the 1800s, I think it was the 1800s, the crowbar was not like our crowbar. It was straight, pointed at one end and flat on the other. Well, one of the holes was filled with charge. And by the way, Phineas was a very holy man, considered he worked for the railroad. He had an accident. He was considered very religious. He attended church. He didn't womanize. He didn't drink, whatever. So he had the accident. And basically what happened is he was pounding the crowbar down the hole that was already charged and on the flat end. And it launched with an explosion all the force into that pole and rod and drove it through his skull. And because it was hot, it cauterized. So it was a very unusual circumstance where the wound was serious and automatically also cauterized. And he survived it. He survived it. And it healed closed, and it basically, they exhumed his body years later. I think it might be on my list. He exhumed his body later and did x-rays on him, and they saw that the frontal lobes were completely wiped out. And he lost sight of the left eye because it was severed behind the eyeball. But here was the difference. He no longer was considered holy or a good person. He was womanizing. He didn't go to church. He drank, Condemned. He was condemned. What's going on? That's a real big part of the conscious brain is the frontal lobes. Permanent, never recovered. Is at the seat of morality. Neuroscientists won't say that, but this is taught in medical school now, even today. Unconscious contents. I think I left, I should have put in another slide here now that I'm seeing I have time. So I'll tell you about it. There was another man who, I show it on slides usually, and he lost his eyesight when he was like a month or two old, and it was an explosion, and he went on in life. And this Phineas was in the 1800s. This guy was in 1930 or something, 40, and he was blind, and then he was married. He had 2 children, never saw either, any of them. And very unusual, medicine was able to improve his sight and bring his sight back. That's very unusual. And they did. And they unwrapped the bandages with his family in front of him. And his family, he was so excited to see him. And they thought, isn't this wonderful? But there was a problem. He couldn't remember his wife's face from one day to the next. He couldn't distinguish a square object from a round ball when it was thrown. He couldn't separate the trees from the forest. What was going on? He missed the childhood development of the unconscious brain. That's what they finally determined, because there weren't many cases of this, restoring eyesight. And they determined that in childhood, your brain is taking the conscious effort to learn things and storing in the unconscious the road signs. So when we see our mother, get to know her, and she has a little dimple on one side, your unconscious brain recognizes that and knows that's mom. But if you didn't go through that, you have to analyze everything. And it's slow. The poor guy couldn't do it. He did actually develop, it naturally developed, and he came out of that after 2 or 3 years. The unconscious brain contents. What is in there that is causing these problems after something happens? Well, in there is involuntary breathing. Thank God. If you had to focus in conscious brain, every breath, we would die. Because you have to be awake to do that. You'd lose sleep, you'd die. Habits, virtues, and vices. Habitual. Worldviews. Faith. Now this, I consider this faith with a small f, and I'll tell you why. Traumas. PTSD. What happens is there's a trauma, and then the brain says, avoid this kind of stuff. You know what I taught century prayer to a man who was PTSD from Vietnam. And and basically what happens is there's an explosion, memories that your buddy next to you got killed, and then what happens then is the sound of explosions makes you hide, and what you want to protect yourself. The unconscious brain learns that. So a person that has this can't go to a 4th of July ceremony. You can't handle the explosions. Because the unconscious brain is tying that to the injury, not the conscious brain. So it's actually protecting us, but that can be a problem. God images. Very true. We all have an image of God. We're going to talk to the next presentation about imageless God. And prejudices. The isms, I call them. And you see this today, right and left. And by the way, these are things that the brain is actually using to try to protect us, but it screws us up. Sexism. So a woman is abused by her husband, and she lumps all men in that unconsciously, lumps all men as being something they have to be fearful of. Racism, same thing. A policeman does something to you, and then from then on, the race of that policeman is in your unconscious, and you get worried. Classism, the rich, the poor. Politicism, you see this all the time in politics. And you know what? They all have that common base. The actions of one or a few, you use those to condemn the whole group they're from. And it's in the unconscious. Naturalism, economism, rich, poor, etc., class. Religionism happens there too. There are Christian believers that don't believe that God dwells within everyone on earth. Only those who accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. They have a different view. That's not our Catholic view. Nationalism, it goes on and on. Culturalism, fundamentalism. The question is, how do we unload those from the unconscious? If they're unconscious, by definition, it sounds like, how do you do it? For I do not do the good I want, but I do the evil I do not want. But I see in my members another principle at war with the law of my mind, taking me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Unconscious. Why is habitual sin so hard to overcome? Because it's in the unconscious and it's automatic. I think there's less culpability on a poor person that suffers from that. It's in addiction, it's in other things. It could be looked at that way. Then the Lord said, see, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. I have a question mark because of the unconscious. I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I in you. So many are one body in Christ, individually members one of another. It's that indwelling God that is part of that, the soul and part of the conscious effort to stop sinning. It's that part of the conscience mechanism. Only God, can climb inside the brains of others, hence the reason we can't judge others' culpability in the eyes of God. I was starting to realize how often I was quick to judge others as if I could climb inside their brain. Science doesn't know squat about the brain, frankly. This was part of my journey. I had people hurt me. I had a wife that was bipolar, up and down. Easy to get upset, easy to act like you got all the answers. I did. And this led me to a different place. Stop judging and you will not be judged. Stop condemning and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Stop judging that you may not be judged. Now, before, that sounded like an ideal theological construct. Yeah, I'm smart enough to know I shouldn't do that, but what helped me was the science to realize how. I knew the why. I knew why I needed to not forgive. I knew that. But the how I was struggling with. And I had to deal with that, and science helped me in that. I say if you judge people, you have no time to love them. Each is Jesus in disguise. This is key to my journey. And that was once I experienced the God dwelling within me through my prayer practice and through God's gift, unconsciously, I started to see God in others. And these quotes of people of a person I really respect, in the final analysis, it is between you and God. It was never between you and them anyway. This woman taught me a lot about this. She had it. She may not have had the science, but God gave her that gift to be able to say, when I go and I serve people, I'm serving the God within them, not that guy that's cursing me. There's a true story. When she went out to the streets, there was a man that had maggots over him. True story. And she brought him back to the convent to wash him off and get rid of the maggots. And the whole time, he's cursing her. In my younger days, I would have been cursing him back. Just the way it was. And a young nun said, Mother Teresa, how do you do this when he's cursing you the whole time? And Mother Teresa said, Jesus was just having a bad day. Now, she wasn't trying to say Jesus was cursing, but what she was saying is, I am treating the God within that person. And what's interesting is once you get into this practice of having experienced God viscerally rather than intellectually, it's easier unconsciously to see that God dwelling within others. It's and wonderful to have that be unconscious. Now, I don't say that I'm perfect at this. I mean, but I go down the highway, somebody cuts me off. I don't want to give you the sign I used to give them. But now I jolt and I kind of come back and I focus. It's unconsciously letting go of it. Consciousness evolution. There is almost a sensual longing for communion with others who have a large vision, the immense fulfillment of the friendship between those engaged in furthering the evolution of consciousness has a quality impossible to describe. This addresses that question someone else asked, and I didn't answer very well. And that is, yes, there was a dispersion of cultures around the world, races, cultures, whatever. But what's happening with the internet and pulling people together worldwide, there's a convergence back. Just what this guy said, Teilhard de Chardin. He predicted it. He didn't predict the technology of internet and all that. So we are drawn together. We're starting to realize the pattern that we saw in the universe and in chemistry, physics and chemistry, and starting to see it now in consciousness. This is the frontier of research. So what do we do with this consciousness? Well, now that we realize we are more than just rats, although sometimes we feel like we're in the rat race. Thank you. We start looking at research, okay? And let's talk about definitions of prayer. Meditation slows the metabolism. By the way, just a second here. Well, let me do this slide first. Oh, I'll tell you where I got this. I talked to Herb Benson at Harvard, and he was doing research on meditation. And he discovered that all of these things happen when you meditate. Now, what's interesting is he didn't use the terminology meditation that we use as Catholics, the etymological. And I'm going to get into that because definitions vary. In the next class, we'll talk about that more. But right now, or class, whatever, presentation. So, having said that, where are we going to look for the research? Well, this is a book called Handbook of Religion and Health. Harold Koenig, an MD, Catholic, he pulled together research on that had been done in a lot of different groups, and it was basically in three categories. Those people who believed in God, or theism, liturgy, attended liturgy regularly, and prayed regularly. And the practice was mainly discursive prayer, not contemplative. And so the medical research, immune system was improved, and what he did was not just specific research. He took 20 studies on the same thing, and he did an averaging of all 20. And he said 70% of them agreed. So it was very cleverly done. Thick book. Sense of well-being is improved, mental illness is better, addictive behaviors less, mortality rate. People live up to 7 years longer with this, with those things that you've done. And the pain management is used quite often with prayer is used. When they did studies, pain pills were the 82% used for pain management. Guess what? Prayer was 76%, but patients automatically doing it. Pain IV meds, 66, and it went down from there. So the patients were automatically using prayer to manage their pain. Community healing. So we are many, are one body in Christ and individually members of one another. This research doesn't prove cause and effect, but correlation, which is very important. Remember how they discovered how cigarettes cause cancer? It wasn't cause and effect, it was correlation. They did statistical studies at first. God's healing. He went out about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. So Jesus was into the healing process. And the question is again, how? Remember St. Augustine Hippo said, we don't know the laws of nature completely, so let's take a look at it. But there was one study that came up that wasn't so hot. Well, when I say hot, it was disturbing. Confirmation bias. Studies shows that human tendencies search for, interpret, favor, and recall information from the unconscious in a way that confirms one's beliefs or hypotheses while giving disproportionality less attention to information that contradicts it. That means that all those studies that I just quoted are subject to this problem. Now we've got a problem. We've got confirmation bias. The prejudice is in the unconscious, da-da-da-da-da. Got it? Now, what is confirmation? It's rationalization, automatic, and you'll see these are descriptions of the unconscious. Unintentional, indeliberate, mechanistic, evidentiary, irrational, illusory. These effects interpretation of all presumably described research and its whole effects before are questionable. So now we've got a problem. How do we deal with that? Unconscious fate. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Carl Jung, psychiatrist. Brilliant. Prayerful reflection. Focus on the cause of sin which breaks relationships. How we may break the unconscious tendency to sin. And you were talking about where does sin roll into this? This is it.